Imagine for a second that you walk into a room and you're wearing a pair of bright yellow tinted sunglasses.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Right. So you sit down, you start reading a book, maybe you strike up a conversation with someone across the table, and you stay in that room for hours. Eventually your brain does this fascinating biological trick where it completely color corrects your vision.
Oh, right, yeah. Your eyes just adjust.
Yeah. You forget you even have the glasses on. You look around and you just assume the walls, the furniture, the light coming through the window. You assume the room itself is naturally inherently yellow.
Because that's all you can see.
Spot on. Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today, you, the listener, are taking a seat at the table with us for a deep dive as we attempt to, well, take off those glasses. We are looking at a stack of analytical sources concerning how our modern Western cultural filters completely obscure the original meaning of ancient biblical texts.
And it is a massive issue.
It really is. We all have these yellow glasses on when we read. And the mission of this deep dive today is to unmask the hidden cultural assumptions that color how you read. We want to see how our modern obsessions with money, status, and the nuclear family twist what these texts were actually saying, allowing the ancient texts to critique modern culture rather than the other way around.
That analogy of the tinted glasses it's a brilliant starting point for what we are looking at today. When sociologists or historians look at human behavior, they often talk about the concept of mores.
No worries.
Mores.
Like the folkways, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I should say precisely. Mores are those unquestioned societal folkways and basic moral assumptions of a society that are so heavily baked into a community that they go entirely without being said. They are the rules of society that you inhale like oxygen from your earliest childhood.
Wow, yeah, like breathing.
Right. A fish does not know it is wet, and a human being rarely knows the specific cultural air they are breathing. The danger here, especially when it comes to reading ancient sacred texts, is a theological trap called eisegesis.
Eisegesis, which is basically the opposite of exegesis.
Yes, spot on. It is the practice of reading your own cultural norms, your own yellow tint, into the text, rather than pulling the author's actual intent out of it. We project our modern standard onto the page, and then, we pat ourselves on the back when the text seemingly agrees with our modern sensibilities.
Right, and that is what makes this so difficult to catch. I keep coming back to those sunglasses. How do we even begin to spot these invisible lenses if they're all we have ever known?
It's incredibly hard.
I mean, if a Western reader is trained by post-Enlightenment rationalism to view the world in rigid scientific categories, or, say, trained by a capitalist society to view certain economic behaviors as normal and good, we're going to look at a first-century document and completely misunderstand the instructions on the page.
Oh, entirely. We read it through a filter that the original author could never have imagined.
So where do we even begin?
To start spotting these lenses, we have to look at the most prominent idol of the modern West. We have to look at money, and we have to look at the concept of allegiance.
Okay, money. That's a big one.
It is. If we turn to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 6, verses 19 through 24, we find the famous passage where Christ commands his followers not to lay up treasures on earth. And he concludes that thought by stating that no man can be a slave to two masters.
Okay, I'm going to stop you right there, because I want to be honest about how I, and probably most of our listeners, naturally read that text.
Go for it.
When a modern Westerner hears, "do not lay up treasures on earth," we immediately shrink the scope.
We really do.
We think of private budgeting advice. We think of a financial advisor telling us to diversify our portfolio, or maybe a gentle nudge from the pulpit to put an extra $20 in the offering plate. It feels like a polite suggestion to prioritize spiritual things over material things.
Polite suggestion, yes.
But looking at the historical record of the sources we have, that is a massive underreading of the text, is it not?
It is a staggering underreading. It completely ignores the historical realities of first-century wealth. Jesus delivered the Sermon on the Mount to people living under heavy Roman occupation.
Right. They weren't sitting in a suburban living room.
Not at all. In that world, wealth was not a number on a digital screen. It was not a 401k that compounded in the background while you slept. Wealth was tied directly to a brutal patronage system.
A patronage system. How did that work?
Well, the Roman elites gained their advantage through cooperation with imperial structures, taxing the lower classes into oblivion. For the peasants, the fishermen, the widows, sitting on that hillside listening to Jesus, they lived with a level of insecurity that modern Westerners can barely comprehend.
Just constant vulnerability.
Exactly. In a highly unstable agrarian society, Physical treasure meant actual food, land, honor, and literal protection from starvation or debt slavery. Money was a concrete social reality. It was a master that commanded unquestioned allegiance because your physical survival depended on it.
So, when Jesus talks about earthly treasure being destroyed by moth, rust, and thieves, he is not just giving a quaint metaphor.
No, he's not.
He is using terrifying realities for that specific audience.
Precisely. In the ancient Near East, your clothing was a primary form of currency. If you had wealth, you wore it, or you buried it in the dirt under your house.
Buried your clothes.
Yes, or your precious metals. The Greek words used there describe the literal decay of garments by moths, the corrosion of metals or stored grain, and the physical breaking in of thieves. In fact, the word for thieves breaking in literally translates to digging through, because thieves would dig through the mud brick walls of a peasant's house to steal whatever was hidden inside.
Oh, wow. Literally digging through the walls.
Yeah. Jesus is addressing the human hoarding impulse. The fallen human heart attempts to secure itself through accumulation. You hoard because you are trying to guarantee your own future in a dangerous world. You're trying to build a fortress against vulnerability.
That makes so much sense.
But then the text shifts, and Jesus uses a fascinating anatomical metaphor. He talks about the eye being the lamp of the body.
Wait, I need to push back on this, or at least admit my own confusion here.
Sure.
Whenever I have read that part about the bad eye in Matthew, I automatically assumed it meant looking at sinful things. I assumed it was a warning about lust, or maybe watching terrible things on the internet.
Which is how almost everyone reads it today.
Right. Are you telling me this entire passage about the eye is strictly about money and economics? How did we lose that translation?
That is a perfect example of the yellow sunglasses. We read our modern individualistic, moralistic concerns into the text. But we have to look at the ancient Jewish idioms.
Idioms like what?
Well, in the biblical vernacular of the first century, a healthy or single eye was a well-known idiom for generosity and an undivided intention to bless others.
Really? Generosity.
Yes. And a bad or evil eye was a specific idiom for envy, greed, and a stingy disposition. You can see this in the Old Testament in places like Proverbs, where it talks about a man with an evil eye hastening after wealth. The heart's treasure dictates moral perception.
So it's about how you see the world financially.
Spot on. A person ruled by money does not just make a wrong choice while seeing the situation clearly. They actually see the situation wrongly because they love the wrong thing. Their internal categories are darkened.
This is blowing my mind a bit. So if your eye is bad, if you have this stingy hoarding disposition, you look at a situation of aggressive hoarding and you do not see greed at all. You look in the mirror and you see wisdom. You see prudence. You see a person being fiscally responsible.
That's it. The darkness within you relabels your sin as a virtue. And that brings us to the climax of the passage, the total impossibility of dual allegiance. The text states you cannot submit to both God and mammon.
Mammon being wealth.
Right. And the grammar of the Greek text here points to the literal legal reality of human bondage. The term behind this concept belongs strictly to the language of slavery. A slave in the first century Roman Empire did not freelance between different owners.
You couldn't just have a side hustle.
No, you could not work 20 hours a week for one lord and 20 hours a week for another. Rival masters make rival, total claims on your life. Mammon is wealth personified as a false god, a claimant to your loyalty.
It demands everything.
Yes, it promises you the security and comfort that only God can actually provide, but in return, it demands your trust, your fear, and your total obedience.
This is where the Western blind spot becomes blindingly obvious.
Oh, completely.
Our culture treats ambition and aggressive wealth accumulation as entirely neutral, or more often, as highly virtuous traits. The covetous person in our society rarely feels covetous. As you said, they call their hoarding wisdom.
They get praised for it.
We write entire books praising people for their aggressive accumulation of capital. We invite billionaires to speak at leadership conferences to teach us how to be just like them. We idolize the very thing Jesus called a rival god.
And we bring that specific capitalist cultural lens right to the biblical text. A modern reader will take the absolute total claim of Christ and reduce it down to a minor adjustment in their personal finances. We think, well, I will just balance God and mammon. I will give a percentage to God and I will let mammon dictate the rest of my life.
We domesticate it.
We do. But the text says balancing them is biologically and spiritually impossible. You will hate the one and love the other. If our culture treasures individual autonomy and financial independence above all else, passages condemning greed or demanding radical generosity will seem incredibly harsh to us, or we will just explain them away as metaphors.
So what does this mean for a modern congregation? If our cultural eye is bad, does that mean we confidently mistake our own darkness for light?
Tragically, yes.
I mean, we police certain sins extremely loudly. We will excommunicate someone for a sexual scandal in a heartbeat. But we entirely ignore economic vanity. We would never dream of confronting someone for blatant, unrepentant greed. We just ask them to join the finance committee.
That is the reality. A Western church might aggressively denounce theft or fraud because those disrupt the economic system we love, but we will openly praise a business ambition that is functionally covetous.
Because it works for us.
Right. The greatest danger is confident ignorance. If believers only notice and condemn the sins that their own secular culture already dislikes, their eye is not yet healthy. They're just echoing their society. They're not reading the text. The text is just a mirror reflecting their own cultural preferences.
Okay, if money acts as this invisible master dictating our values and darkening our perception, we have to ask how our cultural lenses dictate other areas of life.
We definitely do.
If we're getting money wrong, what else are we getting wrong? If the early church was dealing with the social pressures of wealth, you could bet those same societal hierarchies were bleeding into how they viewed relationships in the household. So let's look at 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and the surprising status of singleness.
To grasp the staggering weight of what the Apostle Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 7, we have to spend some time looking at the ancient extremes he was navigating. The Greco-Roman world was entirely dominated by the paterfamilias.
The father of the family.
Yes, the absolute life-and-death legal authority of the male head of the household. Marriage was not just a romantic choice, it was a civic duty. In fact, Roman laws, like the Lex Julia enacted by the Emperor Augustus, actively penalized unmarried adults.
Wait, there were laws against being single.
Oh, severe laws. Augustus was dealing with a post-Civil War population decline and moral decay among the elites. So he enacted laws that hit bachelors where it hurt, their wallets and their social standing. If you were unmarried, you faced heavy taxes, and you were legally restricted from receiving inheritances.
So they basically taxed you into getting married.
Pretty much. The empire demanded that citizens produce legitimate heirs. Celibacy was viewed as bizarre, antisocial, and a failure of your duty to the state.
Let me get this straight. In the broader Roman culture, being single was practically a crime, or at least a massive financial and social liability. You were viewed as a defective citizen if you were not married and producing children for Rome.
Yes, that was the crushing pressure on one side. But on the other side, within the religious philosophical realm, you had these Eastern mystical cults, which later influenced various ascetic movements.
And what did they believe?
They viewed the physical body and the material world in general as inherently evil. They taught that to achieve true spiritual enlightenment, you had to abstain from physical intimacy entirely. They demanded celibacy, teaching that marriage and physical relations were corrupt and dirty.
So you have this massive culture war.
Exactly. Paul is writing his letter to a church in Corinth that is caught in a vice grip between Roman social mandates that demand marriage and ascetic philosophical pressure that despises the physical body.
And Paul's instruction cuts right through the middle of both of those extremes in a way that must have given both sides theological whiplash.
Oh, it was radical.
I mean, on one hand, he fiercely defends the marital bed against the ascetics, saying that spouses should not deprive one another, affirming that the physical body is good and made by God.
Right.
But then he does something that would have absolutely shocked the Roman civic mind. He elevates singleness not just as an acceptable option, but as a specific sovereign gift. He uses the word charisma.
That is a critical linguistic key. Paul recognizes both marriage and singleness as distinct charismatic gifts of grace distributed by the sovereign Spirit of God as he sees fit.
Neither is second class.
Right. Neither is a second-class status. But Paul expresses a clear, undeniable preference for singleness in the context of what he calls the present distress. And he gives a very specific reason why. He uses an incredibly rare Greek adverb, aperispastos.
Aperispastos. Let's break that down, because I know that means undistracted.
Yeah.
But there is a lot of weight behind that word, isn't there?
There is immense weight to it. That specific word appears only here in the entirety of the New Testament. If you look at extra-biblical Hellenistic literature from that era, you find this word used by ancient Stoic philosophers like Epictetus.
And how do they use it?
It describes a state of being entirely free from being dragged in a dozen different directions by worldly anxieties and obligations. Paul is asserting that the unmarried believer possesses a unique, unencumbered capacity to focus their energies entirely on the affairs of the Lord.
Undistracted devotion.
Exactly. An unmarried person is not divided by the necessary God-ordained duties of pleasing a spouse and managing the complex logistics of a household. They possess a freedom for kingdom work that a married person simply does not have.
I want to pause here and let this land, because the contrast between this ancient text and our modern evangelical culture is jarring.
It really is night and day.
In the modern West, particularly in conservative circles, we have functionally idolized the 1950s nuclear family. We treat marriage and having 2.5 kids as the absolute pinnacle of human flourishing.
We make it the ultimate goal.
Yeah. And the unintended side effect of this is that single adults, especially those in their late 20s or 30s, are often treated with subtle suspicion. They are viewed as incomplete citizens in the faith, like they are missing out on the real Christian life.
The irony is striking, and it is a perfect example of a cultural more overriding the biblical text. The sources highlight this stark contrast. The Western Church reacted against the secular sexual revolution over the last few decades by heavily elevating the family.
Which makes sense as a reaction.
Right, defending the family is a good thing in principle. But in doing so, they created a cultural atmosphere that directly contradicts the Apostle Paul. Singleness is rarely viewed as a charisma today. It is rarely celebrated as a divine gift for radical, undistracted devotion to God.
It's treated like a problem to solve.
Yes. Instead, it is viewed as a waiting room. It is viewed as a transitional, somewhat pitiful phase you have to endure until you finally achieve the real status of marriage.
That is so convicting. Have we turned a divine gift of undistracted devotion into a social waiting room?
Sadly, yes.
By obsessing over romance and the nuclear family, modern readers have functionally rewritten Paul's letter. We read 1 Corinthians 7 and we almost apologize for it. We say things like, well, Paul was just having a bad day, or Paul thought the world was ending tomorrow, so he was overly pessimistic about marriage.
We make excuses for the Bible.
Exactly. We completely miss the eschatological advantage he is describing. We miss the fact that he's saying a single person is a living, breathing testimony, that the kingdom of God is more satisfying than the American dream.
We miss it because our modern cultural lens demands that ultimate human fulfillment is found in romantic realization and domestic stability. If you tell a modern Westerner that a single person has a distinct, tangible advantage in kingdom work, it sounds bizarre.
It sounds almost defensive to our family-centric sensibilities.
It does. We assume the text needs to be softened or contextualized away. But the text is clear. Singleness is not a curse to be cured, and marriage is not the ultimate identity of a human being. Both are temporal, earthly realities meant to point to a greater eternal kingdom.
Well, this tendency to bring secular social hierarchies and cultural expectations into the faith does not stop at the family dinner table.
No, it bleeds directly into everything else.
Right. It bleeds directly into how the community gathers for worship. Let's look at what people were wearing and turn to 1 Timothy chapter 2 and the hemlines of gold.
The pastoral epistles, including 1 Timothy, were written to regulate the conduct of the gathered church. To understand Paul's highly specific instructions regarding women's apparel in chapter 2, we cannot look at modern purity culture.
We have to look at the ancient culture.
Right. We have to look at the ancient Roman convivia, or banquets. In the secular Roman world, a public gathering was not just a place to eat. It was a highly orchestrated venue for establishing and displaying social hierarchy.
Set the scene for us. What did one of these banquets actually look, sound, and smell like?
Imagine walking into a Roman dining room, a triclinium. The seating arrangement was strictly dictated by class. The elite patron, the wealthiest person in the room, sat in the place of highest honor.
So everyone knew who the boss was.
Oh, immediately. His clients, the people who depended on him for their livelihood, sat in lower positions. And the food was distributed based on your status.
Wait, they didn't all eat the same food?
Not at all. The patron might be eating imported delicacies and drinking vintage wine, while a poorer laborer sitting at the far end of the room was served cheap, watered-down wine and stale bread.
That is wild.
Everyone in the room knew exactly who was in charge and who was subservient, and a massive part of this display was what the elites wore. They felt a social duty to flaunt their status through specific sumptuary markers.
So church gatherings in the first century, which often happened in the large homes of these very same wealthy patrons, were at a high risk of just mimicking these secular banquets.
That was the danger.
The wealthy patron becomes a Christian, hosts the church, and intuitively tries to run the Lord's Supper the exact same way he ran his Friday night dinner party.
Exactly. And the women of the elite class displayed their massive wealth through their appearance. Paul specifically prohibits intricately braided hair.
Which sounds so minor to us today.
We hear that today and think of a simple French braid, but in the Roman world, this referred to towering architectural hairstyles that required gold wire and took teams of slaves hours to construct.
Teams of slaves just for a hairstyle.
Yes. Paul also prohibits gold and pearls. According to historians of the era, pearls were the supreme symbol of immense wealth and aristocratic pride in antiquity. They were imported at astronomical costs.
The mechanism of what Paul is doing here is fascinating. He commands orderly apparel, reverence, and self-control. But the strict prohibition of the gold, the pearls, the expensive slave-constructed braids, that is not a rule about sexual modesty.
No, it's not.
That is a direct, crushing rebuke of economic arrogance. Paul is saying that the ground at the gathering of the saints must be entirely level. You leave your secular status symbols at the door.
You check your wealth at the door.
When a wealthy woman walked into the assembly looking like a Roman aristocrat, she was functionally forcing the poorer members, who might literally be her slaves outside the church, back into a subservient societal role. She was destroying the spiritual equality of the room.
Yes, the visual display of wealth in the sanctuary imported the secular hierarchy of the city into the household of God. It was an assault on the unity purchased by the blood of Christ. The command is to substitute economic ostentation with the true adornment of good works, which befit those professing godliness.
And here is the massive Western blind spot.
The yellow sunglasses again.
Right. Modern Western churches are highly vigilant about sexual modesty. We have endless debates, youth group rules, and dress codes about hemlines and necklines. Now, sexual modesty is absolutely rooted in biblical principles. But we are completely blind to the mandate for economic modesty.
But we don't even see it.
Believers will walk into a Sunday gathering, flaunting designer clothes, carrying luxury handbags that cost more than a single mother's monthly rent, driving six-figure luxury vehicles into the church parking lot, and no one says a word. We have essentially turned the gathering into a wealthy social club.
It is a profound contradiction. Well, a massive contradiction, I should say. We read our modern anxieties about sexuality into the text, which are valid concerns, while entirely ignoring the very specific financial rebuke staring us right in the face in the Greek text.
Because we don't want to see it.
We have allowed capitalist Moors to interpret the Bible for us. We assume that acquiring wealth and displaying it is the natural, God-blessed reward of hard work, so we see no contradiction when it enters the sanctuary.
It makes me think of modern seeker-sensitive church models.
Oh, absolutely.
Many of these massive organizations use sophisticated demographic marketing to attract specifically wealthy attendees. They design the architecture to look like a high-end corporate campus. They brew artisanal coffee. The pastor wears $1,000 sneakers on stage, all engineered to appeal to affluent suburbanites while functionally ignoring the poor in their own city.
It's demographic targeting.
Why is it that we can instantly spot a hemline that is 2 inches too short, but we are completely blind to a hemline woven with thousands of dollars of excess?
Because confronting the $1,000 hemline would require us to dismantle the very economic system that funds our comfort. The biblical text demands that the church be a countercultural community.
Supposed to look different.
When the wealthy executive and the minimum wage laborer sit side by side in the assembly, perfectly equal under the word, with no visible markers of status dividing them, it is meant to baffle the outside world. When we flaunt wealth, we erase that visual testimony of the gospel.
So far, we have looked at external markers. We have analyzed the subtle tyranny of money, the cultural mandates regarding marital status, and the clothing we wear to the gathering.
Right, all very visible things.
But what happens when a cultural norm is not just an idea, but something so viscerally embedded in your biology that violating it literally makes you sick to your stomach?
This is where it gets incredibly intense.
Let's turn to the narrative hinge of the early church. The visceral nausea of Acts chapter 10.
Acts 10 is the moment the gospel door swings wide open to the Gentiles. But to get there, God has to completely shatter the worldview of the Apostle Peter.
The trance on the roof.
Yes. The scene involves Peter praying on a rooftop, growing hungry and falling into a trance. He sees a sheet descending from heaven filled with all kinds of quadrupeds and reptiles animals that were strictly forbidden by the Levitical dietary laws.
The divine command is shocking. A voice from heaven gives him urgent, immediate commands. Rise, Peter, kill and eat.
And Peter's response is an emphatic, culturally conditioned negative. He says, "By no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is common or unclean." He appeals to his lifelong adherence to the Jewish dietary laws.
Which was a massive deal.
To understand the weight of Peter's refusal, we have to recognize that this was not a casual diet. This was not a first-century equivalent of doing keto or being a vegan. This was the core of covenantal identity.
It was who they were.
During the intertestamental period, under the persecution of Antiochus Epiphanes, the Maccabean martyrs had literally shed their blood over this exact issue. Hellenistic rulers tried to force Jews to assimilate by making them eat pork. Men like Eliezer were tortured to death because they refused to let swine's flesh pass their lips.
It was drilled into their psyche from infancy. The thought of eating this food or entering the house of an uncircumcised Gentile to share a table would not just offend their intellect, it would induce physical, stomach-level nausea.
Physical revulsion.
I want to try to make this real for you, the listener. Imagine a booming voice from heaven suddenly ordering you to eat something utterly abhorrent to your sensibilities, like a live cockroach or a rat.
Just thinking about it is awful.
Your stomach would turn, your gag reflex would kick in, you would physically recoil. That is the level of intense biological disgust Peter is experiencing when looking at that sheet.
That physical revulsion is what makes the divine overriding so monumental. The voice from heaven declares, "What God has cleansed, no longer consider unholy."
A total paradigm shift.
In a single sentence, the external boundary markers of the Old Covenant, the ceremonial laws that kept Israel separate from the pagan nations for centuries, are absolutely dismantled. God demands that Peter violate his most heavily held visceral cultural more in order to demonstrate that the dividing wall of hostility has been crushed.
The wall is gone.
The ceremonial law had functioned its purpose, and now the reality of Christ had arrived.
Think about the implications of that. If God demanded Peter crush his most visceral, historically justified cultural revulsion for the sake of unity with the Roman centurion, what does that say about the societal dividing lines we refuse to let go of today?
It is a devastating critique of how we naturally segregate ourselves. If the shed blood of Christ was sufficient to unite kosher-keeping, first-century Jews with pork-eating Roman Gentiles, people with massive historic, religious, and political enmity, it is undeniably sufficient to unite believers of any background today.
It has to be.
Our fellowship must be based exclusively on that shared redemption, not on shared cultural preferences, socioeconomic status, or ethnic backgrounds. When modern believers self-segregate based on class, race, or political affiliation, they are attempting to stitch the temple veil back together. They are calling unclean what God has declared clean.
We have covered so much ground here tearing down these walls. But if human cultural traditions, prejudices, and deeply ingrained dividing lines are to be completely obliterated in the community of faith, we cannot just try harder to be nice to each other.
No, effort won't do it.
We have to look at the only figure capable of actually breaking down those massive walls. And this brings us to the theological core of everything we are discussing. The perfect submission of Christ.
This is the most critical warning in this entire discussion. Reading these texts about money, singleness, modesty, and dietary laws is not an exercise in moral improvement.
It's not a self-help checklist.
It is not an exercise in comparative sociology where we try to build the perfect, culturally sensitive utopia through our own effort. If we view it that way, we will either become incredibly proud of our own enlightened cultural awareness, or we will fall into complete despair because we constantly fail.
Right. We just create a new set of yellow glasses.
Exactly. Every single text we have discussed must drive the reader away from themselves and toward the perfect active obedience of Jesus Christ.
Yes. Let's look at how Christ fulfills each of these areas where our culture fails. Starting with singleness. We talked about Paul's desire for the unmarried to have undivided devotion to the Lord.
Jesus Christ perfectly embodied that instruction. He lived his earthly life as a single man with absolute, undivided devotion to the Father's will. He was not distracted by earthly obligations, yet his singleness was for a distinct, redemptive purpose, securing an eternal bride in the church.
So human marriage points to that.
Human marriage is a temporal, fading shadow of that eternal, cosmic reality. Christ succeeded where we are constantly distracted.
And regarding wealth and the warning against mammon. We talked about the hoarding impulse and the bad eye.
The King of Glory laid aside unimaginable heavenly riches. The Apostle Paul writes in Philippians 2 that Christ took the form of a bondservant.
A slave.
He did not cling to his cosmic status or leverage it for his own comfort. He lived in poverty, relying on the generosity of others, and died naked on a Roman cross. In doing so, He exposed the total bankruptcy of mammon.
That is such a vivid picture.
Think about the irony. Silver betrayed him, soldiers gambled for his few earthly garments, and the political leaders protected their status by condemning him. Every rival master gathered at the cross to destroy him, and Christ conquered them all by his obedient suffering.
What about the dividing wall? The visceral nausea and prejudice of Acts 10.
As Ephesians 2 states, Christ himself is our peace. His blood is sufficient to wash away all defilement. He abolished in his flesh the enmity, the law of commandments contained in ordinances.
He did the work.
The destruction of cultural prejudice is achieved solely through his atoning sacrifice. He tore down the middle wall of partition between hostile cultures, creating one new man in place of the two. We do not achieve unity by organizing better sociological systems. We receive unity because Christ already purchased it.
This totally reframes the conversation. It is not about you, the listener, trying harder to become culturally aware, or reading a bunch of history books just so you can feel sophisticated at your next small group.
That's not the point at all.
It is about yielding to a king who already conquered these rival lords. It is about recognizing that your cultural lenses are broken, that your eye is naturally bad, and submitting to the one who sees all things perfectly and who gives you his own righteousness.
The gospel appeal is never simply, try harder to treasure heaven.
Yeah.
The appeal is to come to the King who treasured the Father's will above his own life, who died for culturally captive sinners, and who alone can free you from bondage to every rival master. The aim of removing these blinders is worship. We want to see Christ more clearly, hear his word more faithfully, and love what he loves, entirely free from the distortions of our era.
So with the invisible lenses unmasked and the ultimate solution identified in Christ's finished work, what are the concrete steps for you, the listener, moving forward?
Practical application is key here.
Let's recap the invisible lenses we have taken off today. We looked at the subtle tyranny of money and how Westerners often relabel their own greed as prudence. We examined the idolization of the nuclear family, which turns the divine gift of singleness into a second-class waiting room.
Right.
We discussed our absolute blindness to economic pride, where we aggressively police sexual modesty but ignore hemlines woven with thousands of dollars of excess. We looked at the visceral nature of our prejudices and how the blood of Christ obliterates those deep-seated dividing lines.
If you want to continue spotting these blind spots in your own life, there is highly actionable advice you can follow from the sources. The first step is to practice what C.S. Lewis called reading old books.
Reading old books.
Read the Puritans, read the Reformers, read authors from entirely different centuries and continents. No single generation has all the blind spots. The writers of the 16th century had their own cultural blinders, but they are entirely different from ours.
So they balance us out.
Yes. By reading old books, the contrast exposes the narrowness of your own modern assumptions. Second, when you are reading your Bible and a passage feels incredibly obvious to you, and it perfectly confirms your modern social instincts, slow down.
That is a red flag.
That is a massive warning sign. Ask yourself what assumptions you are projecting onto the page. Are you letting the text speak, or are you just using the Bible as a ventriloquist dummy to echo your own culture?
That is such a vital practice. Slowing down when a text feels too comfortable, because comfort usually means we are reading our own reflection. Because if the cultural norms of 2,000 years ago, the massive Roman banquets, the strict lex Julia, the ancient Jewish dietary laws, if they were completely shattered and judged by the biblical text, and our modern norms today are equally judged by it, I want to leave you with a final question to mull over.
Something to think about.
What unquestioned moral certainties of the year 2026, those things we consider so obvious, so normal, and so virtuous today, will look like blatant, absurd idolatry to believers 100 years from now? Remember those tinted sunglasses. You have had them on a very long time. It is time to let the Word of God take them off.